So today I'm here to talk about my holiday gift guide for the 2023 year, just in time for American Black Friday. This is an annual video, a chance for me to talk about books that otherwise I don't always get to cover on my channel. This is meant to talk about books for different age categories, different genres, outside of what I normally read and review. And if that sounds good, if that sounds helpful, hopefully you stick around. And for those watching this, let me be clear, this is going to be a recommendation guide of books, because there are 1,000 videos out there talking about the bookmarks and the accessories and the cute mugs and all of that you can send to bookish friends. But let me be very clear, if you're watching this on behalf of a bookish friend and you're trying to find out what to buy them, if they like books, they want books, not accessories, books. Let me be clear about that. So that is what I've got for you to hear today, with one exception. Everything in this video is going to be proper books to read. And I think I have some good recommendations here, some new releases, and let's get started. First up, let's talk about horror books, and I know there are some of you watching, so if you are someone who is a horror fan or has one in your life, I have two recommendations for you. The first one is How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, and this is a story that follows siblings that go to sell their family haunted house, and of course it is, as the title suggests, possibly haunted. The story goes from there. I've talked about Grady Hendrix many times on my channel before. He's very self-aware of the genre and its tropes, and so as someone who doesn't normally love haunted house stories, this one really worked well for me because of the fact that it is so self-aware and really plays around with it. This is a January release, so you might want to make sure that this person hasn't already bought that book, because Grady Hendrix is fairly popular. But if they haven't checked him out, perhaps if they're someone who normally only reads like Stephen King and some of the more well-known beloved classics, this is a new release that I really think all people, or at least a lot of people who enjoy horror, will enjoy. The other book I want to highlight is The Graveyard Shift by Maria Lewis, and this is much more of a lighter pick. It's more of a horror thriller following this podcast where they do a late night show talking about horror and other cult classics like that. However, in the story, it appears as if someone dies on the radio and then they have to figure out what is happening. This is one that I just describe as a book for anyone who loves Halloween, horror, cult and creepy movies, things like that. This book is just filled with details and references that will delight any horror fan. And I love the fact that it's a little bit more safe than some of the other books I could recommend for horror releases. You'll see that in my favorites, that I have a lot of books that require a lot of content warnings. So if you want to give a book to a horror fan, but you don't necessarily know what their limit is, and you want to stay away from the really like squicky stuff that just might not work for them, this is a very safe pick that is an enjoyable read, but one that will again appeal to a lot of people. I can safely recommend this one without knowing the person's individual tastes much further than this. And I'm interrupting from the future because I have one more horror recommendation I want to sneak in, and that's for those of you that have friends that love the movies by Jordan Peele. So I'm talking about Get Out, Us, and Nope, some of my favorite films. And if you don't know, there is an anthology called Out There Screaming by Jordan Peele, and this is a short story collection, or an anthology rather, done by a number of very popular, well-known Black authors that is, of course, all curated by this famous, well-known director. And so if you love those kind of films, I think you'll really enjoy this collection. My favorite is definitely the first one by N.K. Jemisin, which starts out with a young Black woman getting pulled over by a cop, and it's such a terrifying story. Like a lot of the films that we know and love by Jordan Peele, this one really leans often into the idea of real-life horror, and especially the real-life horror that is experienced by Black people, and I just think it's so topical, so good. There's also stories by Nnedi Okorafor, PJ Jelly Clark, Rebecca Roanhorse, so many of my favorites. These stories are well written and well done. Obviously, with any kind of collection, some stories are going to be stronger than others, but as a whole, this was a really good one, and I think those of you that love the film and are looking for a book to read along with it would really enjoy some of these stories. Now let's go ahead and talk about thrillers, and I know a lot of us have someone in our life who just reads all the big buzzy thrillers that comes out. So they read Gone Girl and The Girl on the Train, and you're looking for something new to give to them for the holiday. So I have two recommendations. The first one is All the Dangerous Places by Stacy Willingham. This is another book that came out earlier this year, so you may want to check out if they haven't read it already. But if they haven't, I think it's a very accessible thriller. It follows a woman, a young mother, who something happens, their child disappears in the night, possibly murdered, just gone. They don't know what happened. Naturally, as often happens, it breaks up her marriage, and now she is left dealing with this. She, at the beginning of the book, gets involved in the true crime circuit in order to make some money, and she gets in touch with people who want to investigate the crime. It's one where the number of suspects is very small, and so we as a reader kind of know that someone within the area probably has some involvement in it, but the book does a good job of shifting our perspectives and our suspicions to different characters. So at different points in this book, I suspected everyone of being guilty, and it just made for a really fun, enjoyable read. Again, while it deals, of course, with child endangerment, which is not everyone's favorite topic, besides that, the book is very safe how it handles those topics. It leans into that domestic narrative that is very popular right now, especially among female readers, and I do think that this one is just an easy one to recommend. It was so much fun. I flew through it, and I think a lot of people will too. The other one I want to recommend is Dark Corners by Megan Goldin, which is technically a companion book within a series, but you absolutely can start here. It's not related to Night Swim other than having the same character. And so within the story, we follow this journalist and podcast investigator who is contacted by this influencer, the social media personality, and after meeting with them, they disappear. This strangely coincides with the release of a certain criminal from prison, and so there's a lot of question about whether or not these are related, and of course the story goes from there. This one I found very compelling, obviously as someone myself who is an influencer, or at least content creator, let's go with that. I am very aware of some of the issues and potential dangers that come with something like this, and so it was very scary and compelling for me that way, but I definitely think that this book has appeal for those that don't necessarily have a social media public account, but instead it's just a very good thriller. It hits on those beats. Again, lots of shifting perspectives and suspicions. I didn't know where it was going, and it was just a really enjoyable read. This is one you also might want to think about gifting on audio because it does have little podcast sound bites within the story. It works really well in the audio form, but regardless of how they choose to read it, I think it's a great one to gift and will be a lot of fun to anyone who enjoys thrillers. Next, let's mention a few science fiction fantasy books that I think would be great to give to someone, even if you don't exactly know their reading taste. These are some pretty safe picks. The first one for fantasy is The Sword Defiant, and this is a book that is the start of a series, so it is a good starting point here. We follow a group of adventurers that have to go and save the world. This book, in terms of setup and narrative, is very similar to something like Lord of the Rings, where they have to go and find the object and save the world, etc. I found this book to be very enjoyable. It's well written, but it's very traditional and classic, which is why it won't necessarily make my top 10 favorites of the year. But if I were to give a fantasy book that's a new release to someone and I don't know their taste, some of, again, my favorite books are going to be very controversial, have a lot of content warnings, and so this is one I would safely recommend. I think that if they like epic fantasy, this is a pretty safe one to gift. I don't think this book is going to offend anyone. I think it's very enjoyable, easy characters and plot, easy to follow through, and just has a lot of, again, that kind of all audience appeal that is going to work for at least most readers and be a pretty safe bet if you don't entirely know their specific taste. Then I also want to talk about The Blighted Stars by Megan O'Keefe. This is the first book in a new space opera series, and the second book is already out, so you actually could potentially gift them together. In this series, we follow two main perspectives, one of a revolutionist, and then we also have someone who is destined to be an heir to this empire or nation, and so the stories get woven together into this. It's kind of a classic space opera where you have like a ragtag group that get thrown together, and you end up finding out that there's some larger stakes happening, and they have to work through their issues and come together even reluctantly. So again, very simple and tropey, but a narrative that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy and find very familiar. And again, I like that as a new release, you can read the first book, and if you enjoy it, go on to the second. And I do think that this is a book that, again, is just great for beginners or people that are newer to science fiction looking to get into it. It is very accessible, easy to follow. While it technically references technology and science, it's done in a very superficial way, which makes it, again, very easy to recommend to someone regardless of their background in science and all that. They don't need that in order to enjoy this book. And I'm going to mention one thing that is not a traditional book on this list. It's the only one, but this is a coloring book for Dune, the official one. I know the second movie has been delayed, but that doesn't mean that you can't still gift something to fans of the books and movie. And so this is a beautifully done coloring guide where you have different, I believe, hand-drawn images in here. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but give you a couple ideas. This is the page I'm working on, and you get to see how terrible I am. This is with pencil crayons. I am horrible at coloring, but this is so much fun. I love the detail in it. There's different pictures of the characters, space scenes, and just some beautiful detail in here. So if you are creative or know someone creative who can actually draw unlike me and color, this one is great. It's super relaxing. I had a lot of fun with this when I'm still working through it. This is kind of my Christmas present to myself, is to keep working through this. So I'm going to be highlighting this one on Instagram if you want to follow me there. But of all the things that aren't books, coloring books for readers is actually a pretty good accessory gift, I gotta admit. So this is the only one I'm gonna recommend that's not an actual book. Let's keep moving on. Next, let's talk historical fiction, and there's two books I wanna highlight here. The first is The African Samurai, and this is a story that follows the true account, or at least true as we know it, of the first and I believe only Black samurai. So it follows them through history. The story is told over two different timelines, one being when they are first caught and enslaved, and then we also follow them in the then present day when they are an adult and living as a samurai. The story is woven into the details of feudal Japan at that time, so the characters get to meet major historical figures like Nobunaga, if I'm saying that right, and I found the story to be utterly fascinating. My only issue with the book is that I wish the story had been told in chronological order rather than jumping back and forth between the past and present, but besides that, I really can't criticize it because I read it in one day. This is a time where a book arrived in the mail and I could not put it down. It was so fascinating. And if you follow my main channel, you know that historical fiction is not normally in my genre. I only read a couple of them a year. But when I read a really good one like this, it makes me wonder why I don't read it all the time. This is one, while it is straight historical fiction, I do think will appeal to a lot of readers who love Asian-inspired fantasy that has those historical overtones, because I definitely had that same idea here, where it just felt very epic in nature. Again, that coming-of-age story, that growing into themselves, being a person in a different land and trying to fit in, dealing with the racial prejudice and all of that. So fascinating, so well drawn. I definitely would read more by this author, and I am just fascinated by this man's story. As a fictionalized piece, this was captivating, and I have no doubt that the real story and the real man are just as incredible, if not more. So if you can't tell, really love this one. And the other one I want to recommend is the books of the Three Kingdoms Chronicles, the first one being the Yellow Sky Revolt. And this is a series I've talked about before on my channel. I've snuck it into other videos just to gush about it. This is a retelling of the classic romantic tale of the Three Kingdoms, which I know personally from watching the 2010 TV show. I've since gone on to read the translated original books, and while I love the story in principle, I do admit that the translated version, at least the one I read, I found to be very dry. And so having a fictionalized version really was a treat for me because it brought the characters to life in a way that I wasn't able to experience in the books and I only experienced on the screen. And so this is a really unique book. It's told from multiple perspectives, and the main idea is that you have the different scribes that are following the main players within the story. So we are not necessarily seeing the story from the eyes of the rulers or those that are trying to fight for power in historical China, but instead following those from the outside that are giving their perspective on everything that's happening. So narratively, it's beautiful. The writing is gorgeous. The story is incredible. And I'm really excited for a book like this because, again, I think it's going to get more readers into this tale, because I know if you aren't someone of Chinese descent, you may not be aware of this amazing epic story. So I love that it's bringing it to life, bringing new readers to this epic traditional tale, and if you can't tell, I love it so much. This book technically was published last year, but there are newer books that have just come out, and so if you enjoy this, you can binge through it. They're available, I believe, on Kindle Unlimited, but if you are looking to gift it, you'll probably want to get a physical copy like this, which is really nice. Now let's switch gears and talk about some nonfiction. So I have a few different books that will appeal to different kind of readers. Now I don't want to blanket everyone who reads nonfiction because definitely different people are drawn to different topics and subjects. So let me give a few recommendations based off my tastes and where they might overlap with you. The first one is for true crime junkies, and that is I Know Who You Are. I gushed about this book earlier on my channel, but basically it follows a retired lawyer who goes on to learn how to track genetic trees and basically uses genealogy information available online to help originally people who are adopted find their original families. However, the police contact them because they are trying to track down who the serial killer is, known as the Golden State Killer, who was of course popularized in the book I'll Be Gone in the Dark. So I suspect if someone is a fan of true crime, they have very likely read I'll Be Gone in the Dark because it pretty much was a bestseller when it came out. And now this book is really giving the behind the scenes of what happened after that book took place, because it actually explains how they used the genetic material that was found at the crime to backtrack and try to find the individual, or at least a close relative of them. And it's just fascinating. Before reading this book, I thought the idea of DNA was just really basic. You pop someone's DNA into some database website and it says, here's your serial killer. But of course, it's not that simple. His DNA was not directly in the database, but instead they had to find family. So you had to work up the tree and down the tree again, talking about the complications of what if people are adopted, what if someone is incorrectly putting the wrong name on a birth certificate, what if there's an affair, what if there's polygamy. There are so many complications, and this book made me fascinated by the investigation technique of using DNA, which has become very controversial, and do you think it's worth reading this book to get an opinion on how you feel about this, because there is a lot of legislation happening around it. If you can't tell from my enthusiasm here, I love this book and I do recommend it to any true crime junkie. It does start out a little bit slow, but once it gets to the main case, I could not stop reading, and I hope you have the same experience whether you get this book for yourself or for another true crime friend. Next, I want to talk about Class by Stephanie Lan, and this is a memoir by the same author who wrote Maid, which was turned into a Netflix TV show. Highly recommend both the show and the original memoir. Essentially, it follows a young woman who separates from their abusive partner. They have a young daughter, and in their first book, Maid, they work as a maid in order to survive, and it gives the experience of being under the poverty line as a single mother and what that looks like in America. This book continues a story particularly focusing on the years in which this young woman was going to school, but she was still living in a state of poverty and was just barely getting by trying to survive. This is one that I recommend to those of you that share my love for memoirs, really love that real person experience. And I will be totally frank that this book is getting some mixed reviews, and I understand why, because as the author, they do not paint themselves in a perfect light. They are very honest about the complications that come when someone is in a position of needing social assistance, and talks about them wanting to be a person. They want to have fun, they want to indulge, they want to have a moment and live a life, and yet they are just barely getting by. And so we get to see the complications of this. You get to see the good, the bad, the ugly, and it's just incredibly honest. So I really encourage anyone who picks up this book to go in with an open mind and understand and recognize their privilege as they read this book, because it's easy for someone who is just comfortably fed, has a full belly and a roof over their head that is secure and safe, that you might judge this person a little bit differently. But if you can look beyond that, I think that this is such an important story, and I want more people to read it. I think it's great for growing empathy, and it's just a really important story to tell. And finally, for nonfiction, for those of you that love science and technology, my recommendation is Hyperspace. And this is a story written by a physicist who is writing for the lay person and talking about the possibility of multiple dimensions. So it's talking about quantum theory and a lot of the ideas about what if there are dimensions that we just cannot see or perceive beyond the fourth dimension. And it's a fascinating story. Now, technically, I mentioned in this video that I'm trying to focus on new releases. This is actually a book that came out several years ago, but it just got re-released as a new audiobook, which is how I experienced it. And I do think, especially for those of you that have friends that love audiobooks, maybe they do a lot of commuting or something like that, and are interested in learning something while they're listening to books, this is a great one to pick up. I do find, personally for me, because I don't have a lot of science background, I find it a little bit easier to go through some of these dense books when they are told to me rather than me just reading it on the page. I find it a little bit less intimidating, and I personally love this author. I've read several of their books before, and this one is just phenomenal. It kind of broke my mind and just really challenged my understanding of dimensions and space and what we know and don't know as a scientific community, and I basically just wanted to geek out about it. So if that sounds like the kind of book that you enjoy, or you know a friend that would enjoy that, this is my recommendation. Again, not a new release, but it is for audiobooks, and even if you want to go with a physical copy, it's still worth it and should still be available. Now, finally, I want to end this video by giving some recommendations for children's fiction. So for children, middle grade, and young adult. Now, for the children's category, if my son was in charge of this video, he would be recommending his favorites, which are Pete the Cat, then we have the Spidey ones, and Peppa Pig. He definitely goes for a lot of the media tie-ins, but I'm going to give some recommendations for children's books that I picked up that I think will appeal to a lot of you that kind of share my love for the spooky and fall season. So the first one I want to talk about is The Great Zombie Pumpkin Parade, and this one is just really creepy looking. So basically it follows this pumpkin parade where all of these individuals are wearing pumpkins, and what I like about this, and this is something I didn't know until I was a parent, is how much kids like books with repetition. So it has like stomp, 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 pumpkin badness, clomp, clomp, clomp. My kid is a sucker for that kind of stuff. So in terms of a great read aloud book, this one's pretty good. The illustrations were a little bit too spooky for my kid, but he's perhaps a little bit of a scaredy cat. Love him, but he's a scaredy cat. But I think for someone who likes something a little bit creepier, I really enjoyed the illustrations in this one. It's a little bit darker. For something a little bit cuter, I like this one as well, and that is I Will Read to You. And this essentially follows a young child, and you know, their mother is telling them stories, and then it goes on to the fact that they're a little bit nervous and kind of the question of like, is there something out there in the woods? And it just turns it into this beautiful story. So it's a story about like imagination and overcoming fears. It's really nice. I think it's the kind of story that you can read to your kids, but you're kind of reading for yourself. So I adore this one. It's less spooky and more kind of that fantastical conversations around some of the topics we try to deal with our kids. So I love this one. And I also want to talk about This Is Fall, which I realize is more kind of meant to be read in the fall, but personally, I read these kind of books all year round. And so I love this one called This Is Fall, which has some beautiful leaves and illustrations. Unlike some of the other children's books I'm talking about, this one is nice because it's more about, again, the fall setting, but isn't so much spooky based. Obviously, I like spooky based, but I want to give recommendations to those of you that don't share my love of creepy children's fiction. And so this one is all about pumpkins and hay rides, and again, it's very cute, all done in like an orange and red style. So I really enjoyed this one. I think it's great. And again, it's fallish, but I don't know, it's my video. I'm going to recommend it anyway. Last for children's fiction, I want to talk about the Monster Mac and Cheese Party, and this one was so much fun. The illustrations are super cute and very cartoony, bright colors, again, great for kids, very much catching their attention, big words, so if you have a budding reader, they can follow along. And this one's just fun, and it follows all the different like kinds of creepy macaroni and cheese, and I think it just appeals to a lot of kids that probably enjoy KD and would enjoy reading a book like this. I had a lot of fun with this one. I think it was super cute, great colors, and just a fun read aloud book. So those are my recommendations for children's fiction here. Now let's talk middle grade fiction, starting with Tessa Mieta is No Hero. This follows a young girl who, along with her sister, goes off to visit her grandparents in Japan. They're playing around the house and end up breaking this heirloom and possibly unleashing this god, and they have to deal with consequences. This is a great fantasy style story that I found to be really fun. This is one I really enjoyed for the cultural elements. I'm always fascinated by Japan, so I would love to give this to someone who perhaps is of Japanese descent, or for any child who is just looking to get better exposure to different cultures and traditions and such. So what I love with this book is that in my mind, it really didn't talk down to the reader. Instead, the story begins with a study guide to life in Japan. And so the author actually breaks out a lot of common Japanese phrases, explaining what a katana is and things like that. And so even for myself as an adult, I definitely learned a lot reading this. And there's some beautiful illustrations, which I always appreciate. There's some great kind of map and artwork that, again, I think really just brings the story to life. And it's the idea that even if someone is a young reader, especially if a reader, say, is going to be reading this as a North American, I feel like they don't dumb down those details. They realize that kids are curious and interested in learning and really leaning into that one. So I love the elements of the story. I had a great time with it. Possibly my favorite of the three I'm going to recommend here, but it's pretty neck and neck. Next, let's talk about the Jules Verne Prophecy, and this is another middle grade book. In this one, we follow a young boy who goes off to Paris in this story. He is there to spend the summer studying about Jules Verne. So within the story, we follow these boys as they are going around Paris, trying to figure out the clues. This, I want to be clear, is not a retelling of Jules Verne's work, but it's very much a love letter to it. So it's an adventure story that is built around the love of Jules Verne and his love for science fiction. So this, to me, is a great precursor for children that maybe aren't quite ready to go into the classics. Now, I know a lot of you watching this are going to say, oh, just make your kids read the classics. My kid, I already know, is one who will need stepping stones. And so a book like this, I think, would be great because you can really kind of create an interest for Jules Verne and kind of step them towards those classics if they're not quite ready to jump right into the deep end. I love Jules Verne as an adult science fiction reader, and so I hope that a book like this will help to get more kids curious about what this author is all about. And finally, for middle grade, I want to talk about the Doomtown Dummies. And this is a supernatural adventure. I don't really want to call this horror because it's not really that horror-ish, but again, I think it's a precursor to horror. It's that slightly spooky story where we follow a young girl who has the ability to speak to ghosts, or specifically communicate with them through the sense of smell, and that is how she communicates with one of her best friends who happens to be a ghost, and of course the story goes from there. This one, I'll admit, the premise of this one sounded ridiculous, but it worked so well in execution. I had so much fun with this story. And if I haven't mentioned yet, this book has some really nice illustrations throughout. That's something I really do look for when I'm recommending middle grade fiction, is I do think that it really helps to still have some artwork, because kids go from these beautiful picture books like the ones I just showed, and then they're just expected to read nonstop text. So I love the artwork within here. It's all kind of a pencil drawn style. It's not on every page, but there's some really special ones throughout. And the story itself is just, I can't find a picture as I say that. Here we go, I keep skipping over them with my thumb. There we go. So this one as well, I think they're just like, they're creepy, they're fun, and again, the story I wouldn't describe as truly horror-ish, but it leans into that. Again, it's kind of the setup to get kids a little bit interested in ghosts, a little bit interested in the supernatural, and again, this one was really fun. I would definitely recommend it if you enjoy something like this. And just because you can't actually touch this version, I'll say that like this cover is kind of nice and fuzzy, which makes it kind of good and gifty, that it is a very nice object to hold. And finally, I want to talk about young adult fiction, starting with Who Will Haunt You? And this is a thriller horror book that follows a young woman who is on the autism spectrum. Specifically, the story follows them and their day-to-day life in school. It appears that other students are going missing, and so they take it upon themselves to investigate what is going on, and the story and mystery goes from there. This is one I just really enjoyed. It's very much a classic story. It's a simple story in a way of a disappearance and so forth, but I really like this one because of that ASD representation. I would argue that ASD can be tough to represent well because it is such a spectrum, and so not every story can represent every person. But what I specifically liked is the fact that those aspects of the character's personality were not their entire personality. They were a person with ASD and not an autistic person. So it was mentioned within the story, but it wasn't the entire story. And I felt like the main character was never set up to be the brunt of the joke, which is often my complaint when it comes to these neurodiverse representation stories. And when it comes again to stories that I would recommend or gift to a young adult, I want them to have those diverse voices, to learn about people that are maybe different from themselves, or perhaps learn about someone who is maybe more similar to them and get to see themselves represented on the page. So that is one of my recommendations. And my other recommendation is Night of the Living Queers, which is a horror anthology that is all centered around young adult queer experiences, specifically set on or around Halloween. I love the premise of this collection. I love that it's very focused, so that it would be a great collection to perhaps read in the days leading up to Halloween. But again, obviously I'm recommending this for a holiday gift guide, so I think it's also appropriate at Halloween and Christmas, I'm just going to put out there. And in terms of the authors, I'll be honest, I didn't really recognize the names that much, but I'm also not someone who knows a lot of young adult author names, so I enjoyed this collection. It was fun, definitely targeted to a younger group, but I'm really glad that these stories exist. If I knew someone, especially who was perhaps questioning or growing into an understanding of their own sexual or gender identity, this would be a great book to pick up. And just kind of, again, a fun story, spooky story, and I think that there is hopefully something for everyone in it. And I'm popping in again with a third outfit change because apparently I cannot film this video in one go. This is unusual for me, for anyone who's new to my channel, but I just could not get this all filmed in one go, so I'm adding in one more clip, and this is to talk about some science fiction and fantasy for young adults. And I will be totally frank, the reason that this clip is coming in late is the fact that I really struggled to give you a recommendation for YA SFF that I really like. I have read a lot this year, but nothing that I actually feel confident to recommend until now. And even this is a cheat. So the one I want to recommend for science fiction fantasy readers in the young adult category is actually middle grade, but I think it's a mature middle grade that actually will serve better to those readers. So this one is A Beanie Song, and this is by PJ Deli Clark, and this is their debut middle grade novel. They have previously written several adult fantasy novels, which I really enjoy. And then this one follows a young girl who is living with her village. These men come in and pillage, and everyone is taken away except for her, who is stolen away by this woman who is like a witch, and thus begins her apprenticeship where she is taught magic. This one definitely could be read by middle grade readers, but reading it myself, I was surprised in terms of even the language choices, the complexity of the story, and certainly there is a lot of maturity to it. Not in a way that would be inappropriate to a young middle grade reader who could comprehend, who perhaps is at a higher reading level. But I do think that, at least for me, I probably would have understood or appreciated this book a lot better at like 13, 14 rather than at 11. So I'm gonna sneak this in as my young adult pick, even though it's a total cheat, I'll be honest. But something with my channel is that I really try not to ever recommend a book that I don't actually recommend. It sounds straightforward, but it's something that I really want to stand by. This is a great one for young adults looking for something more fantastical to read, and this is the one that I would recommend. Now, as for young adult science fiction, I'll be honest, I totally missed the mark and did not find something in time that I would properly recommend. I did consider including a few more Star Wars books that are aimed for teens, but I didn't know if including a media tie-in was a little bit of a cheat. So if you have recommendations for me all, please let me know down below. I would love for you to help recommend books to other people who are looking for books for that age category and genre that I wasn't able to supply here today. So that is it for this video here. I would love to know, of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning to gift, or let's be honest, buy for yourself? And again, this is a newer yearly video on my channel, so I'd love to know if you have any feedback or responses to it. I'm not entirely sure if I'll continue to include all of the younger, middle grade, and children's categories because I am typically an adult fiction reviewer, but it is a great chance to talk about some books that I'm reading that otherwise don't make it on the channel. So if you enjoy this or have feedbacks, changes you'd recommend, all of that is appreciated, so drop it down below in the comment section here. If you're new to my channel and do want to stick around, even though I changed outfits 3 times in this video, which, let's be honest, is not my usual, but life is getting crazy here and I just could not find 30 minutes to sit down properly and film this all in one go. So this is what we did. Hopefully you can forgive me for the obvious changes in outfit throughout this video as I recorded this in 3 sessions. Anyway, if you want to stick around, subscribe to this hot mess, I appreciate it. You can also give me a thumbs up to this video, drop a comment, even if it's just a stack of books or Christmas tree, something holiday themed. Hope you all are having a good holiday, especially for those in the States that are celebrating American Thanksgiving this week. And for the rest of you, have a good weekend. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye-bye.